I'd like to welcome our viewers to our conversations with the authors of the Journal of Educational Controversy. We are a journal that is published at the Woodring College of Education at Western Washington University. My name is Lorraine Kasperson, and I'm the editor of the journal. With me today is my co-interviewer, Professor John Richardson, who is Professor Emeritus at Western Washington University, with expertise in the field of the sociology of education. John is also the associate editor for the journal. My guest today is Curtis Acosta, who published an article in our upcoming issue of the journal called "Dangerous Minds in Tucson: The Banning of Mexican American Studies and Critical Thinking in Arizona." Mr. Acosta was a teacher for 20 years in the Tucson, Arizona school district, where he taught the highly acclaimed Mexican American curriculum. Curtis is an award-winning educator who has been featured in the documentary Precious Knowledge and in profiles by CNN, PBS, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. He is also the founder of the Acosta Latino Learning Partnership, an educational consulting firm that is designed to help educators create dynamic learning environments. Curtis is also taking his doctorates at the University of Arizona in the field of teaching, learning, and sociocultural studies. The Mexican American curriculum that Curtis taught for many years was outlawed by the state of Arizona in a very highly politically charged environment. The incident sparked a nationwide debate over just which populations and whose voices are heard in the public schools of our nation. As a result, the journal is publishing a special issue on the theme, "Who defines the public in public education?" And Mr. Acosta's article will appear in that issue. Let me welcome very much to our program Mr. Curtis Acosta.
Thank
Welcome.
you, Lorraine. Thank you, John.
Thank
you.
I thought we might begin by trying to provide some kind of background to the events that led up to all of this. For our viewers who may not be familiar, the state legislature in Arizona passed a piece of legislation that had the following provisions, and I'll just read them. The legislation said that it was against any program. Let's see. It was legislation House Bill 2281, and it prohibits a school district or a charter school from including courses or classes that promote the overthrow of the United States government or promote resentment toward a race or a class of people, or who advocate ethnic solidarity instead of the treatment of pupils as individuals. There was one other provision that was struck down then by the court later. So that was the legislation that sparked all of this controversy. Curtis, could you give us an idea of how you got caught up in all of this? What were the events leading up to it, and why was your program targeted?
Well, Lorraine, it was about a 7-year struggle or crusade, that, from the language of some state officials, from their rhetoric in Arizona. Our now Attorney General, Tom Horn, who was state superintendent at the time, and now our new state superintendent, John Huppenthal, pretty much used our courses as a way of creating a wedge issue in order to get elected. At least that's how I perceive it now. So it really started in 2006. Now our program had been around a bit longer than that, and we were having some really really good academic results. You know, the outcomes were wonderful. Our students were highly engaged in school. They were participating in civically throughout Tucson, and they were also participating as activists as well. You know, in their lives outside of the space, and sometimes and definitely advocating for social justice issues within the schools themselves. So they were an empowered group of critical thinkers and learners, and we were doing that simply like one of my colleagues, former colleagues, Sean Arce, who was our director of Mexican American Studies, said it was revolutionary, and they're like, people go, oh, and I go, yeah, we were teaching kids to read and write, and, and so in this day and age where so much of this is test preparation and scripted curriculums, and really we see almost the disempowerment of the teacher as a scholar, as a learner themselves, as somebody who can cultivate and create dynamic and rigorous education. We had that opportunity, and we had great results, and so along those lines. We also we got attention, and so the moment I think that really lit the fuse that gave these, because most of the gentlemen that I spoke about, Tom Horn and John Huppenthal, they're from Phoenix, not Tucson. So all of this unrest was 100 miles away from us. So I just was speaking to some folks here in Washington, and I was saying, you know, it would make my AP government, high school AP government teacher's head spin to think that, like, you know, the local control was seized by the Republican Party because, you know, growing up, the old, you know, T-chart we made, on one side Republicans were about, you know, small government and staying out of people's business, but that paradigm has shifted, and most definitely in this case. Where folks 100 miles away who didn't want to visit the program, who didn't want to really know it intimately, wanted their will to be followed. Conversely, a community who actually was participating in the program intimately, parents, students, of course, and other community members knew what we were doing, were advocating to protect the program. But in 2006, Dolores Huerta came to speak at Tucson High School, where I teach, and she had this great speech where she was laying down the complexities of immigration, the immigration debates at the time, the immigration policies, the Sensenbrenner bill, and she was also talking about the war, and she said the Iraq war at the time, and it was her. This is my summary of some of her key points. She was saying that the reason for these this immigration debate was a distraction from the cost of the war and what we were doing in the Middle East. And she said a statement that just flew out of her mouth. She was rolling. She's a civil rights hero that she is. She was feeling it, and she said Republicans hate Latinos. So that little phrase that was embedded in this much larger context became something that Bill O'Reilly and Fox News nationally, and then of course locally, what's going on? And at that time, Tom Horn didn't even know who Dolores Huerta was saying derogatory things about she was Cesar Chavez. Once he found out her relationship to the United Farm Workers Movement and her historical relevance, he minimized her accomplishments, reduced it down to being Cesar Chavez's girlfriend, you know, anything far, you know, all this stuff far from the truth, and really derogatory type of addressing a civil rights hero. And but that was the moment. So Tom Horn came to Tucson to give a counter speech, and he had his assistant superintendent, Margaret Garcia Dugan, give a speech, and he also gave a fax of lists of things that the students could and couldn't do. The students had asked for a Q&A, a sit down with their state superintendent. You would think that would be completely reasonable. He is their state superintendent, but he forbid that. He forbid signage. He forbid any type of backpacks couldn't come in, nothing. Like, the students were to be escorted into this space, sit down, and be very domesticated, listen, and then leave his space, which ironically was their space, their auditorium, their high school. And the students were upset about that, and they launched a pretty ingenious little plan where they wore on white T-shirts, "You can silence my voice, but never my spirit," and they wore outer clothes, layers that you all know in the Northwest real well. You know, you got to layer up. And so they took off at one point. A student leader, Arnold Montiel, took off his shirt and stood up during the speech, and then put blue duct tape on his mouth, and as a symbolic gesture of silencing student voice, and a bunch of we have those spring-loaded chairs in the auditorium, so you hear boom, 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 boom. About 100 students, 75 to 100, I would say, students stood up silently. And Tom Horn later said they put their fists in the air and they were disrespectful. And that was you can go back in the archives of the newspaper at that time and find that nothing was never mentioned about that. And I was in that auditorium. I didn't see that either. And but they made their statement was loud, even though it was silent, and it was creative as heck. And that became a moment, I think, that took us in a direction that we found ourselves 7 years later losing our program. However, even before the speech, Tom Horn had walked into Tucson High and been interviewed by the Arizona Daily Star, and at that time they had video interviews that they put online, and I can't find those. Hopefully someday somebody can. But he said, "I will see the end of this program," even before the incident that I just said. So I think he had found himself a new piñata to hit. He had earlier been elected on English only and ending bilingual education, and he ran for state superintendent on his record in Paradise Valley School District of ending women's studies. So he had quite a track record of regressive and oppressive type of platforms that could launch him into office.
You know, there have been so many misconceptions and misunderstandings about your program. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what was the content of the courses and what was the pedagogical approach that you used?
Yeah, the pedagogical approach was actually something that, you know, we were definitely a group of teachers that embraced critical pedagogy, the idea of critical thinking, the idea of empowering students to be able to analyze the world and to find their own path in it, and to the Freudian, Paulo Freire, like conscientization, right? The idea of being able to examine the world and seeing the restraints upon their lives, and be able to then transform, build an analysis and build a plan to transform those restraints or those obstacles in their lives. So we were definitely we were about that type, creating that type of discourse, that type of freedom, and we also grabbed our own funds of knowledge. Luis Moll, Norman Gonzalez, and Kathy Amate's work in Tucson is actually the term funds of knowledge, the educational theory of the fact that your communities are steeped with resources and academic opportunities to engage in school, but the charge should be for schools to go and reap and investigate and find those funds of knowledge in the community, the cultural capital, the social capital that can be used then in the classroom as a basis to build. So our own indigenous epistemologies that we had in the classroom, which were all around that we used in the classroom, which are all around rehumanizing education. So there's a concept, a Mayan concept in Lakesh that we use. So, tú eres mi otro yo, you are my other me. And there's a poem written by Luis Valdez where he has a stanza where he talks about in Lakesh. And we would use that as a daily recitation, but also to reinforce the principle of why we're doing this. Why gain an education? Why are we here in school if it's not to make a better world, if it's not to see each other as this human potential in one another and to help each other reach that potential? And then we had also some what folks would say Aztec, but we call Mexica, the Mexica principles. So there was indigenous principles that we had learned through the codices and from our elders that we were taught, and we applied those to the classroom. And concepts like Tezcatlipoca, which is self-reflection, Quetzalcoatl, precious and beautiful knowledge, Huitzilopochtli, the will to act, and Xipe Totec, transformation. And those are at the center of the calendario, the sunstone, the Aztec sunstone. And so we were able to use that type of a framework and that type of tapping into our historical knowledge, the knowledge of this continent, to serve as like kind of a way of framing what we were doing, but also to tap into to get rid of those deficit mindsets that often permeate mainstream media, that Latinos don't care about education, that they're not, that internalized oppression, but to know that the wisdom of your indigenous ancestors had this much knowledge, and it was still applicable today, served as a way to reinforce themselves, on this continent, in this time. So they knew their past, they knew their present, and they could build their own and design their own journey for the future. So that's kind of the pedagogical lenses, and so we would use all sorts of different content. Everything from hip hop and looking at Common and Kanye West, and it's a little dated now, but everything now Macklemore maybe, and we just used that last year. But everything from hip hop to historical like documents, the maps that are were used during like the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and looking at the ancient the migration patterns. It was all whatever the moment was, wherever the students were leading us, we were making sure that we were tapping into that as much as we knew that we had to. We were cultivating the skills that they needed to be successful in college and beyond.
I often wondered, after the students had gone through that kind of experience, how did they react to see their books being boxed and the program being talked about the way it was? What was the students' reaction to all of this?
It was a range of reactions, and I appreciate that question, because so many times we can get caught up in the political wranglings and forget who it really affected. Mm-hmm. So at the end of our program, you had happy middle-aged men in their of European descent, and devastated young Chicanitos and Chicanitas, young Chicanos, from like middle school up to young men and women who were really empowered and excited and had their hope resuscitated. I used to say all the time, that our job is to resuscitate the hope in education and the belief in changing the world into a better place. And so they were in tears. Some of them were angry, and some of them were stunned and kind of went through this kind of like almost paralysis, like what just happened to us. But I'm really proud of their responses. Were always with those principles in mind of En La Quech. So it's funny, En La Quech was used as a way for us to re-examine school and how we should be with one another in the classroom and in the community. And then it became something that we reminded ourselves as people attacked us with their rhetoric and with their policies, that we shouldn't go out and couldn't go out and do the same things to them, that we couldn't respond in that type of manner, that we continue to rehumanize Mr. Horn, Mr. Huppenthal, Dr. Stegman, locally Dr. Petticone, who were really doing awful things to these young people. And we needed to name the awful things that were happening. Mm-hmm. The students needed to name that, and they needed to stand by that, but they couldn't go into this type of retributional mindset. That's no different than what Thoreau wrote that inspired Gandhi, and Gandhi inspired King, and those principles are the ones that we embrace. And but yeah, it really affected them, Lorraine. You had students, like I said, that weren't eating, that were stressed out, and their parents were intensely worried about, once the program was taken away, that's when you saw those moments. Up until that point, and it took a little while for us to reestablish ourselves and figure out how to respond, but up until that point, for about 5 or 6 years, it just became something the students learned. It's another thing they learned, how to participate democratically. They would go to school board meetings. They would voice their opinion to the school board during the call of the audience religiously. Every 2 weeks, there would be representation. Anywhere from 50 to 300 folks would show up, depending on the severity of the agenda. but they were always there participating. They knew who the school board members were. They knew how they were elected. They were learning. They were getting their civics class. It was better than any AP government class that I had, right? And they were living it. So at that point, when they knew to put like the concept of Huitzilopochtli, they needed to put their beliefs into some type of action, and how they formulated that. We could mentor it, we could listen to them, we could empathize, but we weren't in a dogmatic group, and we weren't replacing one dogma with another. Mm-hmm. We were creating space for them to figure out how they were going to move forward in this world, because that's what we wanted. Once they walked across that stage with that cap and gown, if they just had some other person's dogma in their mind, they were going to be just as lost after the moment of high school as someone who gets a test prep curriculum and doesn't ever get to find themselves right now in the classroom and who they are as a human being and as a scholar and as an intellectual person. So we cultivated their sense of self. That was very much at the core. So we also watched them participate through hope, their activism or their engagement. It wasn't all of our students, but it was many of them, became something that they did to feel to counterbalance that hopelessness that so many times people feel, and when they feel like there isn't any empathy or no one's listening to them in the political process. A lot of us are going through that nowadays, and we didn't feel that in Tucson because we were too busy working, being active to wring our hands.
Mm-hmm. I know there was a lawsuit that you were involved in, and others were involved in. What was the basis of that lawsuit, and where is it right now? What is its status?
Yeah, a group of my colleagues and I who, we had met with each other on Saturdays is how we got to really develop who we were, in the classroom. How we shared this indigenous knowledge that was new to me. How we deepened our socio-political analysis. How we deepened our own theoretical foundations. We just met on the weekends with the Caves Donuts, and it's a famous donut. And the donuts went away as we got older, and we had to get the cholesterol. We had to start watching those things, and it started to become a lot more fruit and yogurt based meetings. But before we had professional development credit for that, we were meeting because we knew it was so nice to have compañeros in this type of work, and we were able to teach one another and learn from one another, and grow together intellectually as a group, and to become better pedagogues, and hopefully better maestras and maestros for our students. So that group, and then eventually became the same group of folks that sued the state of Arizona. So we filed a lawsuit in 2010, in the fall of 2010, against HB 2281. And then we added students to it, and that was critical because at the moment we hoped that the teachers would have standing, but we didn't. But the fact that the students were later adjoined onto the case, they had legal standing, and so it went to the district court, and unfortunately, tragically, the judge assigned to our case was the federal judge that was lost in the Gabrielle Giffords assassination attempt. Oh. So it's interesting how Tucson, this nexus of or convergence of this awful convergence of these two things met with Judge Roll, or Judge Roll's death. We were assigned a Ninth Circuit judge, Judge A. Wallace Tashima, to preside over the case, and it took a while, but finally his ruling came out March of this year, and we were unsuccessful on three. They severed the law. You mentioned that earlier. The one part that was actually found unconstitutional was designing curriculum for a particular ethnic group. So we actually, our advocacy, our own activism in challenging that state law was successful on one part. Now we're going to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that was filed within a month, this last April. Washington is tied to that, your state, because Seattle University has been working on our appeal. I'm so humbled by the amount of time, effort that school has given our case. They're just firmly believers in it, and and they've put a collection of other legal minds together to help our attorney Richard Martinez as we go for the ninth, in front of the ninth, and that'll probably be a year from now, and we won't know for. Usually they assign, from what our attorney tells us, is usually they don't tell us, like they don't tell the lawyers and the participants in the case till about a month out, but usually there's about a 12 to 16 month window. So a year from now, we might have some new news as we appeal, where it's a First Amendment void for vagueness argument.
So you're basing it upon First Amendment violations.
Right. Yeah. Correct.
John, do you want to join us with some thoughts?
I assume that the rationale for Horn and Company, especially the sentence or the statement that you kind of quoted, the rationale being, well, let's cut to it, a fear of a cultural group, whatever it might be, of gaining, of gaining strength, of gaining political strength, especially by way of their own active instruction and scholarship and debate and struggles, intellectual struggles. I would imagine that they don't come out and say it that way. Say the reason we're shutting you down is because. But what struck me, and now strikes me even more, is that there are parallels. I'm not going to say throughout history, but I was thinking of slavery. Reading the Bible was prohibited, and I was thinking about workers in late 18th century in England, in factories in late 18th and late 18th, who were taking time. Young kids in the factories would take an hour, let's say, and read this and read that, and actually some instructors or professors from the university would come in, and they would teach, and not where they came from, working class analysis or anything like that, but they would teach about algebra, and they became very proficient, and that led to the shutting down of those practices. Eventually, the compulsory school attendance laws in 1880. But it also led to the mechanic institutes. So you can't do it inside factories, and their argument was that it was unhealthy. The representative of Horn argument is that we're doing it on a public health basis, something like that. So there are many examples throughout. The rationale underlying the rationale was a political fear, I suspect. The tactic that you're taking, that you have taken and others have taken, is the shutting down, the consequence of that decision, of that action, of that very concrete, blatant dismantling, gives you sort of two options, it seems to me, just for discussion. One option in response is to take them on politically. But that leads to, I think, a necessity. I think they're outnumbered, you're outflanked, you're out everything. The other option is the one you're taking, and which is, okay, well, like the youth in British factories, then you get together and you pursue history, as I would put it. Now to my question or my thought. You see what you've done to me?
That's good context.
I'm on the page with the Mayan Mexican concept and the Mayan principles, and soon I will be going down to Yucatan and discussing such things with Mayan this may sound odd, but just for my thinking here, that's one path to take, and it's fascinating, and I become absorbed by it. But the other path, if you will, is sort of juxtaposing those concepts. You might consider juxtaposing sociological concepts, just because that's sort of my badge, of structural equivalence, of split labor market analysis, instead of the path of common humanity.
Mm-hmm.
You take the path of uncommon humanity. In fact, they have power over you, and anything the kids do is going to be used against them, and so forth. So I wonder, it's the goal, the objective, the end, not end point, but a point to get to, the moment, as you put it, to get to, might be at least adding to Mexican concept and Mayan concept, social scientific analysis, which is a way to meet head on the Horn argument about individuals, because that's their strategy. And in fact, that is not how I look at the social world. I'm sorry, but a common humanity, God love, but not in my lifetime. And but in my lifetime, still, I see groups, boundaries being maintained, not only by the members of that category or something themselves, but by the Horn. Horn wants Hispanic kids to be locked within Hispanic culture or something like that, but don't study it, don't become knowledge about it. Long-winded, but I apologize.
I totally agree. And one of the things that we were to go back to the idea of uncommon humanity, which is interesting, is I think those things can come together, and I think we were trying to do that. So by establishing a class climate, an environment where you felt as a student and as a teacher, I felt this way too, free, ironically, while we were under First Amendment chill, but to free to explore. You didn't have to worry, because if that in Lakesh concept was rooted and maintained and nurtured and grown amongst each other, you could be free to say whatever you wanted, and without having any type of normal academic anxiety and fear as we have as students many times when we sit in a classroom. And the hierarchies between teacher and student also feed that anxiety, right? I can't say that he's the teacher. And what we try to do is break that away so that we could rehumanize ourselves. Through that rehumanization, we must critically analyze our world to where that's not happening. And there's a whole lot of places to look. I mean, it dramatically was put upon ourselves through these legislative attacks and through the rhetoric that accompanied it. But it was even before that happened, we were doing that in the classroom, because there's inequalities and injustices and inequities everywhere, and rooted right in our own schools. And one of the things I love to do is ask my students, like, how does this school happen? Where is school funding? How is this school funded? And invariably, the whole class, or most of them, would say taxes. And I go, good. What kind? And then silence, crickets, right? We know some things. We know enough to answer a question, but we don't practice inquiry into how these systems are built. So that's a moment of connection. We all had school in common. Like, how do you get on a bus and come someplace every day since you were 5 years old, or walk to every day, and everybody trusts it and moves, and you don't know how it works? And that freaked them out, because it's like something we just take for granted.
Right.
But are all schools, do they all look the same, I would ask? So those types of probing questions, and then cultivating their own and generating their own pursuit of their own inquiry. That became the base. That's the basis of the content of our classes. It came from the students' inquiry. So they were looking at those moments of uncommon humanity. And some, immigration was always so, it's right there in our state, and specifically in Tucson, where we're close, we're 60 miles from the imaginary line. So that imaginary line has real impact. The policy of that has real impact upon the daily lives of our students. I'd have classes where a student would obviously be having a rough day, and I would ask them to go out in the hallway with me, either emotionally or anger or disengagement, and we would go and have a moment to go talk. And occasionally it was trouble at home, and that trouble was Dad just got deported, or we don't know where he is. That was a real life, everyday, not every day it happened, but a real life, everyday context for what we were dealing with. So the students could see that uncommon humanity in their lives and breathe it in the air in Tucson. And I would conjecture you can do it everywhere.
I would, absolutely. What intrigues me is that that the students, I was a substitute teacher in Oakland years ago, and like, wow. And so what fascinates me, which is probably not the right word, it grips me, is that students, we all do basically, but students come to the preliminary space that they, and I say preliminary for the moment, is that they come to things by way of their personal experience. Now, just to play devil's advocate for the moment, I might suggest that personal experience is a powerful stimulant, prompt, but it runs its course. And when that's another point, that to go from their personal experience to the experience of almost negating their personal experience. And you can do that by way of metaphoric or analogical comparisons. You mean the other group, they were like mechanic institutes. Their books were taken away from them. So they begin to move out of their personal experience and to a broader analytical understanding.
Absolutely. The anecdotal is powerful, and I'm a personal believer in empathy. And so the key to empathy, and we would talk about this in the classroom, because people are like, well, that's not got to do with your literature content and the skills and the standards. It has everything to do with it, because if you're going to go and you're going to be a researcher one day, and you're going to need to write, and you learn to write in my class, you're going to need to understand. You're going to need to understand an issue so well, and create a culture where somebody feels listened to, right? Because that's how you get qualitative data. And that goes through numerous different disciplines too. But I just wanted to use that one for simplicity's sake. So the idea of listening to one another being the key to empathy, we would overtly talk about that, because we would be looking at these stories, these counter narratives, as Delgado and Stefancic said, right, in critical race theory, the idea of counter narratives, giving voice to the silence, the marginalized stories that don't typically make it to, especially public school, the public school canon or curriculum. How powerful that is in legal scholarship, but also how powerful it is in an education context. So by having those types of discussions in class, then we can reach back and go, all right, now that we've emoted a bit, now that we felt we've been listened to, now we can begin the analytical process. Now we can begin to go through the scientific process, if you will, the scholarly process. And it's also, not to westernize this too much, to balance it back to our indigenous principles. The first concept that we would introduce, and it doesn't mean it isn't a linear type of paradigm, okay? But Tezcatlipoca is self-reflection, right? So that's important. So self-reflection is that piece where anecdotally or personally you can connect to something. But Quetzalcoatl is precious and beautiful knowledge. Well, where do we get precious and beautiful knowledge? From our lived experiences in the world, from others' experiences, from listening to one another. That to me, and again, this is me and the way I internalize these concepts. That's analysis. That's the beginning of developing an
agree.
analysis.
Right.
And then Huitzilopochtli, that will to act, is develop analysis, create a plan, and then put that plan into action.
Right.
And that's just great scholarship, right? That's just the ethical things that we try to teach from kindergarten through your doctoral program about how you should go about doing your work as a scholar. So they really go hand in hand.
Right.
They are humanizing. And there's also like a little Venn diagram between Western knowledge and pre-Columbian knowledge here in this continent that we can like use both and empower ourselves as human beings.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this is all of our history. This is all of our knowledge. And we get out of that hierarchical type of epistemological debate about whose knowledge is valid and has value.
And you could go to Confucian concepts, you can go
Absolutely.
to African concepts. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also go to your Eurocentric concepts, how they delimit and juxtaposing them to Confucian. I
Yeah.
mean, the opportunities are fascinating.
Yeah, we have to create that. I mean, that is the true classroom. That is
Yeah.
using the world as our classroom.
Mhm.
And that's really, something I learned from our elders is like the serpent, right? The koa is the most precious, entity on the earth according to the Mexica, which challenges the symbolism of Judeo-Christian view of the snake, right? So the koa is the reason why is because all of its movement, it's embracing Mother Earth, Tonantzin. And so, of course, if you embrace Mother Earth with all of your movement and with your entire body, you're going to soak up the most knowledge. And so that's a concept that I think we can bring to the classroom about respecting all forms of wisdom that people have gained throughout time. And we shouldn't limit ourselves into these kind of nationalistic or racial lenses that limit the way we see the world. However, we must embrace those ethnicities on an equal level because there's wisdom from those communities that we need to put in the mixer.
Right.
Curtis, one of the things that we like to do with this series is to help our readers kind of get a personal look at the author behind the article. I was wondering if you could, we have about 5 minutes left or so, I was wondering if you could share with our viewers something about your own background and what led you into teaching and your own background.
I'm a biracial kid. I'm not a kid anymore, but just for the purposes of feeling better about my long day ahead of me. So I'm, my mom's Swedish, a couple generations back from Sweden, and then I'm Chicano, Mexican American, and I think that growing up before we had the term biracial, we were halfies, we were whatever, we didn't have names, but the world chose what we were, loud and clear. But I think that impacted me in a number of ways. It allowed me to when I walked into a room, I always had to wonder how the people were going to see me. Was I not going to be white enough for this audience? Was I not going to be Mexican enough for this audience? And I shouldn't say audience, for this room of people. And regardless of how I was treated, that's how I had to walk. That's how I walked into those spaces. It's kind of a dark way of looking at the world. That when you're a little kid and having to think about some room that's supposed to maybe embrace you and love you, that I was still a little bit shy and anxious about how I would be viewed. But it led to becoming a person that got to look at the world, and I love to talk, but I really learned to listen too, because that way you learn. I had to listen to languages, because that was a key. That was to where I was at, and I also had to listen to the way communities talked about the other, because that would also give me an idea about what was going on. And I think just that experience was one that led me to the way I view the world, and the way when I was presented with these principles, I embraced them totally, because it takes away that that angst and that strange alienation that I think some of us feel as we grow up when we are two different cultures or more. And my mom's a teacher, and my dad is a keen reader of the world himself, and just knows people and politics. He was a successful businessman, but he was more than that. You know, he could. Everyone loved my dad, who worked for him, and so I saw that. I saw how he had con cariño. He would call people mija, mijo. He would embrace them, and I watched that as a youth growing up, and I watched my mother as a kindergarten teacher, who just was unbelievably loving and gracious, but also had had academic rigor. You know, she was gonna help kids read, and she was great at it. And those things formulated who I am. Those things, those people, my family, my parents. And I think being a comic book fan, I stumbled upon this through my own doctoral program. For years, I would be asked in different veins to go through my literacy background, because it's a really good exercise for folks. How'd you learn to read and write? What did you read and write throughout? And I would say all the time that I stopped reading. I was a voracious reader when I was a youth, and then I stopped reading in middle school. And then finally, I was in a class with Dr. Kathy Short, who is on my committee, and I love her to death. She's a great teacher and such a smart woman. And I slowed down. Kathy got me to slow down and go, oh no, I was reading comic books. So that social justice streak in me, I think it's all Batman's fault. I really do, you know. And I was getting there's something to be said about, at least the time I was reading those books. There's something to be said about standing up for folks that are hurting, who need an advocate, who need a hero. And I don't have a Batman complex. Don't get me wrong, or a Superman complex, but I remember going to Kathy. Oh, like we were literally we looked at each other and went, that makes so much sense. So you never know. So when you challenge, if there's some folks out there right now that are watching this and they're like, well, I wish you'd stop reading those things. You never know how mainstream media might actually inspire some. Hopefully, some folks think I've done some positive work, and I anticipate engaging in this struggle for equality and equity for our students for the rest of my days. And but you never know. You never know.
What are you doing now?
I
think you've.
I'm supposed to be finishing my dissertation. So if this is online and my committee members are listening, yes, I'm doing that. I am analyzing my data. It's taking a little bit longer, but I started. I had a need. I was literally banned from my curriculum. So I tried last year to teach without my 10 years of experience, because we were banned from the curriculum that we had created as Mexican American Studies teachers.
You were banned?
Yes.
By
the directives given to me from our district.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, anything that we had created as Mexican American Studies teachers, we couldn't. So I had all my depth of knowledge was pretty much chucked out, and I would have to start anew. So I gave that a shot, but it wasn't good for kids. And I tried really hard, and I think I still got them, to write, and they still gained some skills. But it was kind of like feeling like somebody telling me, "Go dig a ditch." I'm like, "Sweet, I got this backhoe here. I can get that ditch dug. It'll be beautiful. It'll be strong. Be whatever you want it to be, and I'll be done in minutes." And they're like, "No, here's a spoon." And so I was fascinated as an educational researcher, because I'm like, oh, let's watch at me as a test case. So I kind of was outside my own self going, let's watch him struggle without his curriculum. Mm-hmm. We'll see how much of it's pedagogical and how much of it's curriculum. And really what I found out, and I wasn't really doing a study, but I was still studying, still reflecting, still practicing Tezcatlipoca. There's a real marriage between a learner, an educator, and their tools. It's mm-hmm. like Picasso and paint and a canvas. It's like Rodin and the marble. When you take one of those elements away, you suffer. So I decided to try to take this where can I be effective now? And so I'm doing education consulting work, and just starting my business, and it's designed around empowering teachers to feel this about themselves, where they can have the mindset of tapping into the community and the resources and the cultural capital of the students to create empowering spaces that are rigorous and filled with academic achievement. And I'm visiting. I've been fortunate enough to have some jobs in Connecticut and to South Dakota. I'm going to New Mexico next month. But it's a wild world out there, and it feels good to know that people are embracing these concepts that are currently banned in Tucson at home. It's the best type of retribution and revenge, is to plant the seeds elsewhere and watch them grow, as my friend Jose and compañero Jose says in the film Precious Knowledge.
I was often curious about how did they justify banning Shakespeare's Tempest?
That was my move. I couldn't. Yeah, when they gobbled us dead that night on January 10th, 2012, I leaned over to one of my compañeros and I said, "I'm gonna get Shakespeare banned tomorrow. Watch," because they had to. They had to if they were following their own resolution, which that shows you the absurdity and the absurdity of the law. So the Tempest is Shakespeare. I don't know why we don't teach the Tempest as like a staple classic Shakespeare experience for all United States of American students, because it's about contact. It's about Europeans coming to this. And it's the only time this continent, and it's the only time Shakespeare wrote anything that was topical and timely, because he was a smart businessman. He wanted to write those comedies and those histories that made the Queen and the King look all, oh yeah, we want more of that, right? You know, your great grandpa, look at what he did. He was great. But on his last play, he decided to show a little bit about how he saw the world, what was going on. It's fascinating. So it's about colonization. It's about the enslavement of two of the natives. So how the heck am I supposed to teach that when I was being told to avoid anything about ethnicity or race, oppression, and class? That was the advice I was getting at that same meeting.
Advice or dictates?
It started, that was the day after the gavel, so it was really nice at that point. Everybody was feeling, I knew that was going to be the most humanizing moment I was going to have with the administration in my building, because it was like everybody knew the injustice that was being unfurled in front of us.
Yeah.
So it was advice at the time that became edicts.
Jeez.
And so you can't, I wasn't safe to teach Shakespeare under those conditions.
The consequence would be losing your job.
More than that, it would be violating state law and being prosecuted.
Oh
Well,
boy.
let's. I hate to end on that, Mark.
Oh, no.
We could go on and on, but I think we're out of time. Let me thank you again for joining us and for sharing your thoughts with our audience.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor, and spending time with you all. It was a pleasure as well.
And thank you, John.
No, thank both of you.